So these are some basic functions that we should already know. So the first one is a quadratic function. So basically the function part of it is the square. So that's what's going to do something to the number. And the general form of this is we have our x minus p squared in the inside squared, and on the outside we have a times a and a plus q. So that's our general form. The cubic function is going to be the same as this quadratic, but the cube part will be the function. And so if we want to actually, we could actually write the general form of this as well. Okay, and we could have this look like this. Okay, y equals a x minus p q plus q. Now, the reason why we might want to do this is because we're going to start seeing that whatever happens in quadratics actually happens in cubic. So whatever the a does here, it actually does the same for the cubic. Whatever the p does here, it does the same for the cubic. Whatever the q does here is going to do the same for the cubic function. So functions actually behave the same way apart from the actual function part of it. So times a is going to be times a, minus q is going to be minus q, plus q is minus p is going to be minus p, and plus q is going to be plus q. The only thing that's different is the actual function. This is going to square, this is going to cube. So here we can have cubics. We can actually have any power, which represents functions. We're going to have n power polynomials as well as functions. So the other functions that we should be familiar with are the square root function. Okay, so when we square root a number, we get the square root function. And the function part of that is going to be the square root part. And again, we can actually write the same thing. We can just say that y is equal to, well, there's a function part of it, square root, but the p is going to do the same thing, the a is going to do the same thing, and the q is going to do the same thing. The only difference between these three functions is the actual function part. This will square is an input. This is going to cube the input. This is going to square root the input. Okay, that's really the only difference. And we should know what these graphs look like. Okay, so the graph of a parabola, we should know, looks just going to look like that. That's our basic parabola. The cubic you may or may not be familiar with, but the cubic function is going to look like this. The square root function is going to look like that. And then we also have the reciprocal function. The function part of the reciprocal is the divide part. We're dividing by the input. Okay, so that's the function part of the reciprocal function. And the reciprocal function has this shape. The exponential function is when we have the variable in the exponent, so the base stays the same, but the exponent can change. So the functional part of that is the actual base exponent part. Okay, and we can change the inside, and we can get different things going on with this function here. But the basic functional exponential part is going to look like this, and all exponentials have basically the same shape. The other function here is the absolute value function. You should know what this looks like. This is a v function. And again, what the absolute value is going to do is take positives, keep it positive, takes negatives and makes it negative. You may see why that get the shape here, right? This positive is, if we have just a linear function, that's just going to stay the same. The negative parts are going to end up being positive, so we get this V shape. So what is new, though, is this semicircle function. So you probably have not seen the semicircle function. If you haven't seen one of the other functions and know what they are, you really should get to know them, because we should really know what these functions are to start. The semicircle is likely new, though, so this is one we'll have to get used to. But the semicircle function basically looks like this. Okay, so we have semicircle. My semicircle function looks like that. And the functional part of it is the square root r, and this actually should be r squared. Okay, so this is r squared. That should be r squared here. Square root r squared minus x squared. Okay, so that's the blue part represents the functional part of it, what happens to the input, and the x is my input. Okay, we get a graph that looks like that. So this is going to be new, and just to explain where this came from, this actually comes from the Pythagoras theorem, because if I have an x and a y, like that. I have a radius, and this triangle I can draw anywhere in this circle. So I end up with x squared plus y squared equals r squared from Pythagoras. And I can solve for y, and getting rid of that squared, I can undo it with a square root. I have to remember to do plus minus when I do that. Now this will give me the top half and the bottom half of the circle, but to make it a function, I have to get rid of the bottom half, so that's why we only have the positive square root of r squared minus x squared. So this is a new function, so we're going to have to get used to this one, but the other ones we should already know, and we're going to assume that we know these, so if we don't, make sure that we familiarize ourselves with these other functions.